So if you've watched any of my videos on the core ideas of Western civilization, then you probably heard me say that Christianity single-handedly invented the concept of the person as we know it and understand it today. Many scholars have attested to this historical reality, but the one that made the biggest splash a few decades ago was Metropolitan John Zizioulas in his book, Being as Communion. This book is great. It is an absolute classic of patristic synthesis and Eastern Orthodox theology, but it is a little on the technical side. So I just want to take a moment to briefly summarize his core ideas with regard to the Christian concept of the person and how it differs from the Western account on this Eastern Orthodox account. So the primary word that you want to wrap your head around and make sure you really understand when you're delving into Zizioulas' argument is this word here, ontology. This is a $20 word, as my mother would say. And what this word means, of course, is being, from the Greek ontos, which means being, but it has to do, when used in a philosophical or theological context, with the nature of existence or the nature of a thing's existence or how it exists or in what fashion it exists. When you think about existence and ontology in a Western mindset, generally speaking, we think about existence in terms of substance. There's a kind of substance-based thinking that we employ in the West, or what you might call substance-based, and there are reasons for that, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and so on. But the idea is that, generally speaking, when we think about ontology, the way that things exist, we're thinking about them in terms of their substance or their natures. There's a human nature, and human beings participate in that nature, and that's how they have their existence. Or maybe there's a divine nature, and that's what God participates in and how he has his existence. The problem for Zizioulas is that on a substance-based ontology, personhood gets relegated to this secondary category. Person becomes something that you add to a substance. There's a human nature, and then you add something on top of that, and that your personhood, let's say, and that's what makes you who you are, your particular characteristics. But the core thing at its heart is a substance or a nature. And we see this on the ontology of the pre-Christian pagan world, in which person is not something central. It's specifically something like a mask that you put on, that you have a different role that you play. And Zizioulas emphasizes that it comes from this Greek word prosopon. And a prosopon is almost literally a mask that you wear. It's kind of referring to the stage masks that people would put on in the theater and the roles that they take. That role part is very important. Because your personhood on an ancient Greek or Roman paradigm is the role that you play in society. Some people have a face, a mask, before the law, other people don't. And you have different faces or masks with regard to your different social relations. But at the end of the day, the person is not some, as Zizioulas puts it, unique, unrepeatable entity. It's simply a collection of your different properties and your masks and your roles that you wear and play. And what's central, what's at the foundation of who you are is your substance or your nature. And this is where the emphasis on fate comes from in the pagan paradigm. You're trapped by your nature, by the ordered whole of the cosmos, and the person cannot defeat any of those things. The person is subservient to fate, to nature, to the elemental powers of the world, to the gods, and so on and so on. But all of this changes when Christianity comes onto the scene. According to Zizioulas, it's the Cappadocian Fathers who put forth a radical transformation of this idea that the person is just a mask, the prosopon is something you put on. In fact, the prosopon becomes something that you are in your totality. All right, so what does this mean? Well, for Zizioulas, what this means primarily is that the person becomes an ontological category all to its own, equal to this idea that substance or nature is an ontological category. What are the reasons that he gives for this? Well, the idea is that on a Christian concept of God, God is Trinity. And that means that God is a community of persons. And so for Zizioulas, it's very important that God on a Christian concept is not some kind of divine substance like Plotinus. He's not some kind of thing that can't help but exist. That would seem to constrain God to his nature. Instead, God is a community of persons that cause each other. What does that mean? Well, the Father, of course, begets the Son and brings forth the Holy Spirit. And he does these things out of his love for them, out of his free will, in other words. So love and freedom and the Father's willingness to bring the Son and the Spirit into existence is what causes and creates the Trinity. So how this works is a little technical and it seems a little circular, but that's the point. So buckle up. So what makes Christianity unique and distinct from the other monotheisms or the Greek monotheism at the time is that Christianity's claim is that God's nature is Trinitarian. That's what God is in his nature. Now, the content of this Trinitarian nature is, of course, the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But these persons have their source in the Father. The Father freely out of love begets the Son, and freely out of love brings forth the Holy Spirit. So there's a sense in which the Father is the ultimate source of the other members of the Trinity, and therefore the Trinity itself. So God's nature as Trinity is in fact caused by a person, specifically the Father, the will and love of the Father to beget and bring forth the other two persons. And of course they exist in eternal relation, meaning there wasn't a time when the Son or the Spirit was not, because of course to be a father, that's a relational word, to be a father means to have a son, and in a less obvious way in English to have a Holy Spirit, but that's another topic. So if God's nature is Trinity, and the Trinity's source is in the Father, then that's how God's personhood, his personhood as God the Father, can be the source of his nature. That's how person can be an ontological category. It's not just God's divine substance that constitutes what he is. It's the will of the Father and his beingness as a person that allows for the Trinity to be what it is. This sort of prompts the question, well, what do we mean by person? And Zizioulas' definition for personhood is the title of his book, A Being in Communion. So communion then becomes this fundamental ontological category for reality. And that's how we can say that God is love. When we say God is love, we don't just mean God is super loving. It's not hyperbolic language that St. John is using. He means that the content of God's nature is love, and that can only make sense if God is a loving community of persons. So God's not reducible in his nature any further down than these three persons in relation with one another. There's no divine nature that undergirds the Trinity that's somehow more basic or more primary than the three persons. Sometimes this gets articulated this way in the West, and Zizioulas is very critical of it when it does. He gives the example of how lamentable it is that modern Western catechetical books start with Chapter 1 on the one God, Chapter 2 on the Holy Trinity, and he says separating those things in that order is all wrong-headed. It should be Chapter 1 on the Holy Trinity, because that is the most fundamental, irreducible way of talking about the Christian God. And that's pretty much the whole thing, but I do want to mention one little bit before we finish, which is this word hypostasis. So this word hypostasis features heavily in Zizioulas' discussion, and it's a difficult word to wrap our heads around, not only because it's one of these untranslatable Greek words, but because how it gets used historically changes from Greek philosophy into the hands of the Church Fathers. So originally it means something like the undergirding nature. It's more of a synonym with nature, with substance, and that sort of thing. And you can kind of picture that if you know some Greek. It's a hypostasis. It's sort of the undergirding stasis, the thing that's there at the bottom. So it's a synonym for your nature originally. But it gets transformed through the Church Fathers, especially the Cappadocians, to come to be more of a synonym for person. And it's able to do this, or rather, they choose to make that equivocation because they want to emphasize the total, irreducible ontological category of the person. It's a hypostasis, which is a radical transformation from the way this word is used prior to that, and Zizioulas gets into this into his text. So that's pretty much it. This is just a brief overview of some of the key terms in Zizioulas' discussion about personhood and how Christianity makes these unique contributions to theology, to philosophy, and if you want to be anachronistic and put it that way, to human rights. Because, our whole concept of human rights now, this idea that the human is somehow of incredible dignity and value, uniquely and unrepeatably, each individual person, is due to Christianity's basically invention of the human person, which doesn't exist prior in antiquity. The rest of the text is very interesting. It gets into all sorts of things about the Eucharist and the role of the sacraments in the church, and how mankind can be divinized through participation in the liturgy and all this kind of stuff. But it all kind of starts with this foundation. So hopefully you have a better sense now, just a little bit, of John Zizioulas and being his community.